Thanks, Anne, and good morning, church. Great to be with you today. As you heard, if you're a guest here with us today, we are in the season of Lent, which allows us time to prepare ourselves for Easter, which is coming up in just 5 weeks. And I will tell you all that we have a Lent problem. It's not your problem as much as it's our problem, those of us who are teaching over the next 5 weeks, because we are following the Gospel of Luke, and Luke has placed a massive amount of content in this last week of Jesus' life. And so if we are going to get to Luke's description of the Easter weekend in time for our Easter, we are going to have to look at a few really large chunks of Scripture at one time. Today is one of those days. I'm sorry. Buckle up. Today we're going to look at 44 verses. Yes, 44 verses describing 5 different interactions between Jesus and the religious leaders. That's a lot, but we will do it, and we'll get through it, okay, in the next couple hours. Listen, my one hope is this today, that you will leave with a better understanding of the overall flow of events of Passion Week and how Jesus ended up on a cross 5 days after entering Jerusalem. We're going to understand that a little better after today. My other hope is that as we move into communion at the end of this service, my hope is that we would be able to answer this authority question of who has authority in our lives in a really clear and humble way. So we're going to dive in together. And we're going to read a chunk of the 44 verses, not all of them. But I will say this, Luke chapter 20, which is where we're going to be looking today, there's a bunch of different interactions, but the fundamental question is this question of authority. Who has it and why? And if you've been following the story with us over the last number of months, you will realize why this question of authority is coming up. Jesus has entered Jerusalem in a very carefully crafted way that declared for everyone who could see it, I am the Messianic King. And the people celebrated him. The religious leaders thought it was just a big charade. And then to the people's surprise and to the religious leaders' horror, Jesus enters into the city, and he doesn't go and meet with Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, and deal with Rome. Jesus, we looked at this last week, Jesus goes to the temple of all places. And he confronts the Jewish, religious, and political leaders for their lack of concern for the poor and the marginalized and the lost, for maintaining a system, a religious system that no longer facilitated a connection with God as it was intended. And Luke tells us that Jesus, having cleansed the temple, which is what we looked at last week, he then uses that temple space for its original purpose. He goes there each day to teach and to proclaim the good news of God's kingdom that was breaking in through his life and his ministry. And the crowds follow him there. And not surprisingly, so do the religious leaders, the temple leaders. They have a few questions for Jesus. And again, it's not surprising. At the top of their list is this: by whose authority are you acting and teaching? Because you're not a priest at the temple. You actually have no sort of official status or function in the temple. So why do you think you can just come in here and act like you own the place? And this will begin what I would call a very long description in Luke 20 of a cat and mouse game between Jesus and the religious leaders. Sometimes one of them being on the defensive, the other one on the offensive, and other times the other way around. Let the cat and mouse games begin. One day as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? They said. Who gave you this authority? He replied, I will also ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, he will ask, why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin, all the people will stone us because they are persuaded that John was a prophet. So they answered, we don't know where it was from. Jesus said, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. So we learned something right off the bat about these Jerusalem temple leaders here. They're less concerned about discerning and knowing the actual truth than they are about maintaining popular opinion, which then facilitates their position of power and prestige and wealth. Now, the question that Jesus asks the religious leaders is a problem for them because John the Baptist was a very popular prophet among the people. But if you believed John the Baptist's message, that his baptism was from heaven, well, then you would believe what John the Baptist said about Jesus, and that is he is the coming one that we've been waiting for. And so if you say you believe John the Baptist, then you have to also say, I believe you, Jesus, that you are who you now have declared yourself to be. But the religious leaders can't do that. They've already determined that Jesus is a fraud. But if they say that, they're saying John the Baptist is a fraud, and that would mean losing the support of the people. And so they don't know what to do, and so they do what a lot of people do when they're in a conundrum. They just play dumb. We don't know. And so Jesus responds back, well, if you won't give me an answer, I'm not going to give you an answer. But then Jesus goes on to tell a parable that implicitly, but also very clearly, answers their question, or at least it starts to. So in verse 9, he went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one they also beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, what shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love, or my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. This is the heir, they said. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, God forbid. Jesus looked directly at them and asked, then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately, because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. But they were afraid of the people. I said a few weeks back that Jesus is done flying under the radar, right? Now that he's arrived in Jerusalem. And this is another example of that. This parable is not subtle, and Luke says as much. The religious leaders get it. They know exactly what Jesus was saying. It was a scathing, offensive critique of the temple leadership. And if the temple action of Jesus didn't really put him at risk, then this parable certainly did. We would say, or we could say, this one would have sealed his fate. So I want to dig in just a little bit into this one because it helps if we know a little bit of an Old Testament background to help understand why the religious leaders would have taken such offense to what Jesus was saying. So first, it's just helpful for us to know that in the Old Testament, Israel is sometimes described as a vineyard. It's a metaphor for the nation. And in Isaiah chapter 5, the prophet writes this on behalf of God. I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hill. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a good crop of grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now, you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it only yield bad? The rest of this chapter will go on to say that this vineyard will end up being torn up because it wasn't providing good fruit. In a sense, Isaiah is saying, Israel, as the vineyard, you've quit valuing and living out the heart of Yahweh. That is love and justice and generosity and compassion and goodness. And the inevitable result of your rebellion against Yahweh will be exile. You'll be torn out. You'll be removed. And that takes place in 6th century BC. Babylon comes and overruns Israel, and the nation is in exile. They're scattered. And by using this particular metaphor in his parable, Jesus is actually making a very controversial statement to the temple leaders and to the crowd that is listening, and that is this: this is going to happen again. Because the temple leadership has not only rejected the vineyard owner's servants, that is, the prophets who have gone before the Son, the most recent one being John the Baptist. The question had just come up. But now they have rejected the beloved Son. That's the word that Jesus uses in the parable, the beloved Son. Remember Luke chapter 3 when Jesus is baptized. What does the Father say about Jesus? This is my beloved Son. At the Transfiguration in Luke chapter 9, this is my Son whom I've chosen. Listen to him. But the religious leaders won't. The majority of these temple leaders refuse to believe, and in light of their continued resistance to the owner of the vineyard, Yahweh, they are going to be removed. And the vineyard, Israel, will be given to others to lead. And when the people hear the story, they're like, God forbid, this is terrible. Jerusalem, our holy city. And Jesus responds with a question and then an uncomfortable conclusion from the question. He quotes Psalm 118. All of a sudden, he's talking about a stone. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. What is all this about? Well, interestingly, Psalm 118 is what the people cried out when Jesus came into the city as king. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And not only that, Psalm 118 describes how God's chosen one is surrounded by people who want to harm him. And after a time of extreme challenge for the chosen one, God comes and rescues him and vindicates him and saves him from death. And in celebration of this, the psalmist writes, I will give thanks to you, for you have answered me. You have become my salvation. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Now, it's helpful for us to know this as well, that in the Old Testament, specifically Isaiah 8 and then Daniel 2, God's anointed one, the Messiah, is sometimes called a stone, or a cornerstone, the most important stone in the building. And this stone, the Messiah, that gets rejected by the leaders, that the leaders want to harm, will actually be rescued by Yahweh and vindicated by God, and he will actually be the one that then rightfully judges those who refuse to welcome and accept the king in their midst. Okay, I know that's a lot. If you've kind of glazed over, just listen to this summary. By telling this parable and by then quoting this psalm, Jesus is essentially saying this to the religious leaders and to the people listening. He's saying this: the religious leaders have rejected the messianic king, the cornerstone, and the authority that I have as the beloved Son from the Father. And the result is going to be disastrous for them and for this city. And so don't align yourself with them. Reject the ones who are rejecting the cornerstone, and avoid a similar fate yourself. Through this interaction, Jesus is making an absolutely shocking declaration that the temple leaders, the highest leaders, the religious leaders in their nation, the temple leaders have been stripped of their authority to be Israel's shepherds. Declared by who? Declared by Jesus, the beloved Son, the Messianic King, the cornerstone, the one who sits at the right hand of the Father, endorsed by Yahweh himself. Yowza. This is the very definition of speaking truth to power. And not long after it, he'll be dead. And we can start to appreciate why the religious leaders determined after this parable, we can't sleep on this. We can't wait on this. We have to deal with this guy, and we have to deal with him quickly. But there's a problem. And the problem is the people are eating this up. And we love the praise of the people. We need the people to maintain our positions of power. What are we going to do? Well, let's try and trap him. Let's trick him into something. Let's discredit him. Let's get him to say something that will lose the public appeal. Or even better, get him in trouble with Rome. And so the cat and mouse game intensifies. The religious leaders send people, probably commoners, so they could just blend into the crowd. And they butter Jesus up a little, and then they ask him a thorny political question. And we're not going to look closely at these next two, but let me just tell you what the questions are. In verse 22, we get a description, or in verse 20, we got a description of what's going on. And then in verse 22, this question that's asked of Jesus: is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, the trap here for Jesus is really simply this. We know that taxes of Rome are a pain for the people, but they're more than that. It's this political lightning rod. It reminds the Jewish people that they are not fulfilling their destiny as God's chosen people in the world. They're subjugated. But here's what we don't know. We know tax collectors are hated, but the taxes that were collected flowed through the temple and from the temple to Rome. And in that day, some people thought that was totally inappropriate because it's pagan. It's a pagan coin. It's impure. This place of God's holy dwelling is being made unclean by the temple leaders who, P.S., took a cut. The temple leaders taking the money of the taxes and then sending it on to Rome. You're desecrating God's holy place. Other people, especially the leaders who are profiting from it, said this is a justifiable compromise. It allows us to continue to worship and keep the temple and keep our religion under Roman rule. And so the question really that Jesus has to answer is, if he plainly says, yes, pay your taxes, then the people will say he's disregarding the holiness of the temple. I thought this guy was a reformer. I thought he was a man of no compromise. But if Jesus says, no, don't pay taxes, well, then he's going to be used to whip up the people as a rebel to incite rebellion against Rome. How will Jesus get out of that mess? Well, he essentially says, again, we're not going to spend as much time on it as I would like. He essentially says, listen, give to Caesar's what is already Caesar's. I mean, his face is on the coin anyhow. And give to God, or Yahweh, what is Yahweh's? Question, according to the Jewish Torah, what is Yahweh's? Everything. The earth is the Lord. And everything in it, including us. So Jesus responds in such a way where he says, you know what, this isn't primarily about coins, it's actually about you. Give yourself to Yahweh. Love him with all your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength. And part of what that means is you'll quit resisting what Yahweh is doing right now in front of you through my ministry. So Jesus dodges out of that trap, and it motivates another group of people to set up another trap for him, the Sadducees, a subgroup of the religious leaders, we could say. The Sadducees are the only Jewish religious leaders that don't believe in the resurrection or the afterlife. And so, interestingly, they come to Jesus with a question about the afterlife. And they give him this crazy scenario. Jesus, tell us about this. A man marries a woman and he dies. And so the second brother marries the woman because that's what Moses said in the Old Testament law that needs to happen. But then that man dies too. And so 7 men, 7 brothers, all marry this one woman and they all die. Very likely, definitely suspicious. I think that would become a Netflix special in our day and age. And so this impossible scenario, ridiculous scenario, and then their question in verse 33. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her? Ooh, boy. All right, potentially awkward scenario for the 7 brothers, yes. Now listen, the trap for Jesus here isn't actually related necessarily to the afterlife or even to marriage. The trap here, the real question that Jesus is going to have to navigate is Moses. Do you follow and do you ascribe to the teaching of Moses, the greatest Old Testament prophet? Do you submit to the Torah? Do you correctly interpret it and apply it? That's the real question that's being asked. And so Jesus, again, in his response, he's not trying to give us a comprehensive understanding of heaven or marriage in heaven. He will answer and say, there actually isn't going to even be marriage in heaven, because marriage is this good gift given to humanity that actually is a sign that points to a better reality that's to come in the life, that will come in the life to come. That's a whole other topic for a whole other day. Jesus barely mentions it. And then he quickly moves on to, well, I have a question for you guys as well. You asked this question, but I know you don't actually even believe in the resurrection. But how can that be? Because even Moses, your most highly esteemed prophet, during the burning bush encounter with Yahweh, he actually speaks about his forefathers who are long dead and buried, but he speaks to them as if they are still living life after death. So my question to you, Sadducees, is do you agree with the great prophet Moses or not? And it's at this point when the temple leaders and the religious leaders in Jerusalem, finally the penny drops, because the Pharisees up north actually experienced this in Galilee as well. Trying to match wits with Jesus is a losing endeavor. And so they go silent. They're like, this public debate thing isn't working. We're out. But not all of them. Because the scribes, which is another group of a subgroup of religious leaders, they've just had their view of the afterlife affirmed. This was a great debate, right, between the Sadducees and the other religious leaders. And they've just heard Jesus say there will be no marriage in heaven, but there is an afterlife. And so they're like, yes, well said, Jesus. It's like that you can just see them turning towards the Sadducees going, ha, 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 you know, that kind of stuff. And so Jesus actually looks to them and responds to them and says, oh, you like my interpretation of the Torah, do you? Well, let me ask you what you think about this interpretation. And Jesus moves from being on the defensive to going on the offensive again, and he answers the question about authority one more time. Not in a parable, but by presenting this Old Testament interpretive puzzle, which is a bit of a mind bender, but here we go. Luke 20, verse 41. So Jesus turns to the scribes and he says, why is it said that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself declares in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. David calls him Lord. So how can he then be his son? So Jesus quotes from Psalm 110. And the common interpretation at that time was that Yahweh, the Lord, spoke to my Lord, and my Lord is David speaking in the third person, which sometimes the authors do. So it's really, the common interpretation was, the Lord said to me, David's writing this, sit at my right hand. Sit at my right hand. This is a position of authority. But then Jesus interprets it a different way. David is saying, Yahweh spoke to my Lord, David is saying, my Lord is the Messiah, sit at my right hand. So Yahweh said to the chosen one, the Messiah, sit at my right hand. And so then the question, Jesus says, how could the Messiah be David's future offspring, but still be present for this discussion? And how could David recognize his son in a patriarchal system as his Lord? Like I said, it's a bit of a puzzle. But Jesus' interpretation and his answer that's implied is very clear. I have authority because I am not just King David's heir. I'm also his Lord. By whose authority are you doing all these things, Jesus? To go back to the very first question at the beginning of the chapter. Jesus' answer, I am acting under the authority of Yahweh as the pre-existent messianic King and Lord, the beloved Son who sits at the right hand of the Father. And I am bringing an entirely new way of relating to God that is no longer related to these temple leaders or this temple of brick and mortar. That's done. God is doing something new through me. That is game, that is set, that is matched to Jesus, the one who has all authority. Now, we're not totally done. We're done for today. Jesus is going to say a few more things that will inflame the religious leaders even further. And eventually they're going to desperately decide we can't take him during the day. We'll take him in the shadow of night. And they will deal with this one. But even in just these few moments, and a very general summary of these interactions, help us to understand why Jesus got into so much trouble so quickly as soon as he entered the city. But as I said, as we move into communion, I actually want us to consider this question of authority not from a biblical Luke 20 perspective, but from a personal one. Because as we read through these stories, I think it's easy for us to cheer Jesus on and say, yeah, Jesus, go get him. Show him who's boss. But we have to ask ourselves the question, who is my boss? Who has authority in my life? We might quickly agree with Jesus' interpretation of Psalm 110. Yes, he is Lord. He is Lord of all. But we simultaneously have to ask ourselves the question, is he Lord of me? You see, we live in this culture that tells us in 1,000 different ways that you are the highest authority of your life. Your inner voice is the truest voice. It must be followed. Your happiness is the highest good to seek. Your freedom means you can do whatever you want. Your identity is self-determined and crafted by you. In implicit and explicit ways, we are told over and over and over again, you are the primary authority of you. And so it's really, really easy in this kind of context that we live in to begin to frame the life of faith incorrectly in a way that keeps me as authoritative over Jesus. He's not Lord of me. He's more like my spiritual advisor, so I can kind of maintain a well-rounded sort of personhood, a holistic kind of way of being. That's not how Jesus frames salvation. It is about releasing authority. It's about surrender in its most radical form, to die and to give up trying to rule and run our own lives. Jesus, in the most loving way, will say, you, each one of us, we're not intelligent enough or wise enough or good enough or powerful enough to strategize our way into the life God made us for. We do not need a better plan. We need a new life. We need resurrection life. We need a Holy Spirit-empowered life that is gifted to us in our salvation as we surrender everything to him. As we give him the authority over every area of our life to make sense and something of our life. In my observation of being a pastor for the last 3 decades, I think these are some of the most difficult areas for us to surrender or to give God authority in. I think it's very difficult for us to give God our future hopes or our dreams about what we want our life to look like, or our closest relationships, or our reputation and what others think about us, or our pain and our hurt and the desire for justice immediately or our vindication, our sexuality, our finances, our children. God, you can be Lord over some of my life. God, you can have the authority over most of my life, just not this. It's too important. It's too personal. It's too seemingly costly for me. It's too risky for me to let go of. I'm going to manage that myself. And today might be the first time that you're actually thinking for a moment that Jesus isn't some kind of soft, sort of pushover kind of guy that says, "Oh, shucks, that's okay, don't worry about it. You know what? I'm just glad to have a small say in your life. Thanks for considering some of my thoughts." No. Jesus will, in kind but very clear ways, address our arrogance, confront our stubbornness, name our reluctance to give up control, and then he will put the question before each one of us: do you trust me enough to let me be Lord in all parts of your life or not? And so my question as we enter into communion is, how would you answer that today? Or how does, I didn't write this down, how does the way you've been living the last month answer that question? I'm going to invite the worship team to come up here now, and those who are going to help us distribute communion. And I'm going to invite you to just reflect on these questions, or this particular question, as we participate in communion. This is our opportunity to remember the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, a representation of his blood poured out for us for the forgiveness of our sins, the bread, his body broken for us for our healing. As we take communion together today, if you're a guest with us, we're really glad that you are here. This is a table that Jesus invites his followers to, and if you would prefer to not participate in this, we'd still just invite you to come up with your row as they're dismissed and just simply pass by the elements without receiving them. It's the most discreet way for you to not participate, but also not clog up the aisle and have people trying to get past you. Up in the balcony, we are going to hand out our elements, and so you can stay seated, but down on this lower floor, you will be dismissed, and you can come up and receive the grace of Christ represented in this bread and cup. Who will call the shots in your life? Let's ponder and pray into that in these moments.